This talk, this work I'm presenting, deals with the idea that sexual selection, the strength of sexual selection, could change during range expansions. We used a recent range expansion to test this idea, the biological invasion of Portugal by common hawksbills. If it turns out that sexual selection changes often during expansions, this could be important to understand speciation in nature, because expansions generate peripheral populations, so peripatric populations where many or even most speciation events occur, and because sexually selected traits such as ornamentation are involved in mate preferences, species recognition, and therefore reproductive isolation. But why should sexual selection change during expansions? Which are the theoretical expectations? There are two things happening during expansions, changes in demography and adaptation to new environments, that could influence sexual selection. Regarding demography, usually we have lower densities during expansion. Densities alone should not influence the strength of sexual selection, but depending on the biology of different species, changes in densities could be associated with changes in operational sex ratios or even in the mating system, which would, of course, influence sexual selection. So the effects could go in both directions and would depend on details of the actual species. I'm not going into that here. Here's a theoretical paper dealing with those subtleties. All I want to do here is acknowledge that demography could be a link between expansion and sexual selection, but it is difficult to derive general predictions that would apply to most expansions. For now, that's all. Regarding adaptation to novel environments, we have a little bit the same problem. It has been discussed for a while whether sexual selection is beneficial or detrimental when adapting to a new environment. Again, it can go in both directions. It could be detrimental, for example, because of the costs of ornamentation, or when sexual selection interferes with regular viability selection. Or on the contrary, it could be beneficial if sexual selection intensifies viability selection, for example, by allowing mate choice of the higher quality individuals in those new environments. So again, this can go in both directions. Again, here's a review paper. I'm not going into details. What I want to note here is that during range expansions, the new environments organisms encounter are of a peculiar type. Most expansions proceed from ecologically good sites where the source populations inhabit towards ecologically worse sites, which, because of that, get colonized later. And in this case, we can make a simple prediction, which is the strength of sexual selection should, in most cases, increase. And why should it increase? Think of sexual ornaments. Sexual ornaments typically indicate individual quality. That's why they're often costly and allow mate choice of good quality individuals. As I mentioned, most expansions go towards ecologically worse sites where there are survival challenges that augment the fitness differential between high quality individuals and low quality individuals. So in good sites with plenty of resources, plenty of food, it should be easy for most individuals to survive, provide for their young, etc. But as sites get worse and worse, the quality of individuals becomes more critical, for example, foraging ability, etc. As a consequence, in worse sites, there are also higher fitness benefits for choosing high-quality male mates, because in those sites, the fitness of your offspring depends more critically on the quality of your mates. So there's very good evidence for that, including experimental evidence. So what's written here, in other words, is stronger sexual selection. That's what higher fitness benefits of mate choice means. So at least when thinking of ornamentation, we have this simple prediction that could apply to most expansions, and this is what we try to test using the invasion of Portugal by hawksbills. So the common hawksbill is a small finch, native from sub-Saharan Africa, where it is widespread. It is also a pet bird, and because of that, it got transported to different parts of the world. It invaded successfully many parts of the world. It is good at invading. It is gregarious and an opportunistic breeder, which helps. In Europe, in the Iberian Peninsula, the largest focus of invasion is here in Portugal. It has been happening for the past 40 years, and it was very well documented by work by Luís Reino and colleagues. So we know at which sites walkspills have existed for a longer time, so those darker spots on the map, at which sites they have existed colonized only recently. So we used this information and went out to do field work at 23 sites across the entire current distribution in Portugal. So those sites comprised places where they have existed for a long time, so the redder dots, where they exist more recently, places where they are abundant at high densities or low densities, sites differing in altitude, temperature, precipitation, also the degree of seasonality of climate. So just by looking a little bit at the map, you can see that those things are correlated as expected. So we reduced this information with a principal component analysis. The first component explains quite a bit of variation, and high scores indicate sites with low altitude, hot and dry, pronounced seasonality in rainfall, more stable temperature, and with older and more abundant populations of walkspills. So those trait loadings are all quite strong, which means that the traits go vary a lot. And what we asked was, did walkspill ornamentation change along these axes of the invasion, along these demographic and ecological axis of the invasion? So walkspill ornamentation is simple. There's a red bill, red in the breast, and a red mask. What we did was in total we captured over 500 individuals, on average over 20 per site. We measured the area of red in the breast and the area of the mask in all of them. In the second of our 2 field seasons, we also used spectrophotometry to measure the red color itself. So this red coloration, both in bill and plumage, is based on carotenoid pigments, which need to be acquired from the diet. And we measured red saturation as the proportion of light reflected in the carotenoid red wavelengths relative to the total bird visible wavelengths. We did not use spectrophotometry in the mask because this has these very tiny feathers pointing up, and we get lots of interference from skin reflectance. This is just showing that males can differ a lot in the extent of red and also the quality of the color. I don't know if you see, but it's more pure red here, more brownish up there. I don't think you see. This is just to illustrate how we measured mask area. Okay, so I'm starting by the less interesting results. So for bill color, the only thing we found was a strong sex difference, with males on average having redder bills than females and nothing else. So this table has the results of a generalized linear model on population means with sex as a factor. The invasion principal component I explained before is a covariate, the interaction with sex, and then date just to control for eventual seasonal variation in color. For the extent of red in the breast, we got a similar result, a sex difference and nothing else. For the actual red color in the breast, we found that red saturation increased along the direction of invasion. The black dots are population means for males, white dots for females. Although the interaction with sex was not significant, looking at the graph, we get the idea that the result was driven by the male data, and analyzing the sexes separately, it is significant only for males. So, increasing ornamentation. For the size of the mask, we got something different. Here, there was nothing happening in males along the invasion, but in females, the size of the mask decreased during the invasion. And the interaction with sex was significant, meaning that we also have a significant increase in sexual dichromatism along the invasion. So the results were increasing male ornamentation during the invasion on the red breast, decreasing female ornamentation on the mask, and as a consequence, increasing sexual dichromatism. So those are the descriptive results, and we can think of some 5 factors that could contribute to explain these results, but we also think we can exclude or almost exclude 4 of them, which will leave us with one preferred explanation. So one possibility would be environmental effects. Here the prediction is, well, since this coloration is based on pigments that need to be acquired from the food, as the invasion progresses towards those worse sites, those higher altitude sites where diets, especially winter diets, are poorer, the prediction would be that ornamentation would decrease. So this may be involved in the result we found with females, decreased female ornamentation, but only that result, not the other ones. Other possibilities would be differential dispersal. If, say, redder individuals disperse more, this would create ornamentation gradient along the expansion, or viability selection. If, again, higher quality redder individuals survive better in the worse environments colonized later, this would also create a gradient. But both explanations would predict identical effects in males and females, so they are not compatible with our results, which has opposite effects in males and females. Another possibility, this one is a bit more complicated, is that there are subspecies differing in ornamentation and ecology. So in sub-Saharan Africa, we have different subspecies of common woxbills. They are very, very similar, but they can differ a bit in redness. And it is likely that the captive stock of woxbills is not a single subspecies, but it is a mixture. So if different subspecies have different habitat preferences, say higher altitude, lower altitude, this could create a geographic pattern here in the invasion range. So what we did to address this, and I'll go fast through this, we genotyped the mitochondrial ND2 gene in 10 individuals per site. So ND2 is a commonly used marker for deep relations among populations. It's a conserved marker, changes very slowly, such that haplogroup differences can generally be attributed to subspecies level differences. So we found some haplotype diversity falling in 3 haplogroups, this main group in light green, the second group, and only in 1 individual, a 3rd haplogroup. So there is some mixed ancestry on the woxbills we have here. We do not know yet which haplogroup goes with which subspecies in Africa, but for the moment it suffices to say that when we map haplogroup frequencies, when we put them on the map, well, there might be some geographic pattern, This dark gray haplogroup seems to be a bit more frequent here in the south. But in any case, if there is a geographic pattern, it does not match the direction of invasion, and it is not correlated with red either in the breast or the mask. So eventual differences among subspecies do not explain our results. This leaves us with the last explanation, which is the preferred explanation. As I explained at the beginning, we predicted that in most range expansions, the strength of sexual selection would increase because of colonizing worse habitats. It's the only explanation consistent with all the results that we got. It's the only one able to explain the increasing sexual dichromatism, so the opposite effects in each sex. So to conclude, we found increasing ornamentation during this expansion, which is likely due to increasing strength of sexual selection in the worse, ecologically worse sites that get colonized later. Is this sort of phenomenon common? We don't know. This is only one species, only one study. But it might be common. As explained at the beginning, there's a general prediction in this direction. The results support that prediction. So if this turns out to be common, we need to work on more species, then it could be important because we can start thinking of downstream consequences. For example, it could facilitate reproductive isolation of newly formed peripatric populations, or it could even cause macroevolutionary trends, such as younger species on average being more ornamented. But, well, for the moment, we need to understand this better. Is this common, or is this just an isolated phenomenon? And the take-home message would be, it might be rewarding to put some effort investigating this. Thanks. Interferes with regular viability selection, Or on the contrary, it could be beneficial if sexual selection intensifies viability selection, for example, by allowing mate choice of the higher quality individuals in those new environments. So again, this can go in both directions. Again, here's a review paper. I'm not going into details. What I want to note here is that during range expansions, the new environments organisms encounter are of a peculiar type. Most expansions proceed from ecologically good sites. Here is a knowledge that tomography could be a link between expansion and sexual selection, but it is difficult to derive general predictions that would apply to most expansions. For now, that's all. Regarding adaptation to novel environments, we have a little bit the same problem. It has been discussed for a while whether sexual selection is beneficial or detrimental when adapting to a new environment. Again, it can go in both directions. It could be detrimental, for example, because of the costs of ornamentation, or when sexual selection, when most speciation events occur, and because sexually selected traits such as ornamentation are involved in mate preferences, species recognition, and therefore reproductive isolation. But why should sexual selection change during expansions? Which are the theoretical expectations? There are two things happening during expansions, changes in demography and adaptation to new environments, that could influence sexual selection. Regarding demography, usually we have lower densities during expansion. Densities alone should not influence the strength of sexual selection, but depending on the biology of different species, changes in densities could be associated with changes in operational sex ratios or even in the mating system, which would, of course, influence sexual selection. So the effects could go in both directions and would depend on details of the actual species. I'm not going into that here. Here's a theoretical paper dealing with those subtleties. All I wanted to do is this work I'm presenting deals with the idea that sexual selection, the strength of sexual selection, could change during range expansions. We used a recent range expansion to test this idea, the biological invasion of Portugal by common wagsbills. If it turns out that sexual selection changes often during expansions, this could be important to understand speciation in nature, because expansions generate peripheral populations, so peripatric populations where many or